the new god of air, the new gods of air, the new god of air, the new goddess of air, the new goddesses of air, the new goddess of air, the old god of air, the old gods of air, the old god of air, the old goddess of air, the old goddesses of air, the old goddess of air, the greater god of air, the greater gods of air, the greater god of air, the greater goddess of air, the greater goddesses of air, the greater goddess of air, the lesser god of air, the lesser gods of air, the lesser god of air, the lesser goddess of air, the lesser goddesses of air, the lesser goddess of air, the higher god of air, the higher gods of air, the higher god of air, the higher goddess of air, the higher goddesses of air, the higher goddess of air, the lower god of air, the lower gods of air, the lower god of air, the lower goddess of air, the lower goddesses of air, the lower goddess of air, the greater spirit of air, the greater spirits of air, the greater spirit of air, the lesser spirit of air, the lesser spirits of air, the lesser spirit of air, the higher spirit of air, the higher spirits of air, the higher spirit of air, the lower spirit of air, the lower spirits of air, the lower spirit of air, the major god of air, the major gods of air, the major god of air, the major goddess of air, the major goddesses of air, the major goddess of air, the minor god of air, the minor gods of air, the minor god of air, the minor goddess of air, the minor goddesses of air, the minor goddess of air, the superior god of air, the superior gods of air, the superior god of air, the superior goddess of air, the superior goddesses of air, the superior goddess of air, the inferior god of air, the inferior gods of air, the inferior god of air, the inferior goddess of air, the inferior goddesses of air, the inferior goddess of air, the ancestor god of air, the ancestor gods of air, the ancestor god of air, the ancestor goddess of air, the ancestor goddesses of air, the ancestor goddess of air, the ascendant god of air, the ascendant gods of air, the ascendant god of air, the ascendant goddess of air, the ascendant goddesses of air, the ascendant goddess of air, the descendant god of air, the descendant gods of air, the descendant god of air, the descendant goddess of air, the descendant goddesses of air, the descendant goddess of air, the transcendent god of air, the transcendent gods of air, the transcendent god of air, the transcendent goddess of air, the transcendent goddesses of air, the transcendent goddess of air, the past god of air, the past gods of air, the past god of air, the past goddess of air, the past goddesses of air, the past goddess of air, the present god of air, the present gods of air, the present god of air, the present goddess of air, the present goddesses of air, the present goddess of air, the future god of air, the future gods of air, the future god of air, the future goddess of air, the future goddesses of air, the future goddess of air, the authentic god of air, the authentic gods of air, the authentic god of air, the authentic goddess of air, the authentic goddesses of air, the authentic goddess of air, the synthetic god of air, the synthetic gods of air, the synthetic god of air, the synthetic goddess of air, the synthetic goddesses of air, the synthetic goddess of air, the progressive god of air, the progressive gods of air, the progressive god of air, the progressive goddess of air, the progressive goddesses of air, the progressive goddess of air, the regressive god of air, the regressive gods of air, the regressive god of air, the regressive goddess of air, the regressive goddesses of air, the regressive goddess of air, the ordinary god of air, the ordinary gods of air, the ordinary god of air, the ordinary goddess of air, the ordinary goddesses of air, the ordinary goddess of air, the extraordinary god of air, the extraordinary gods of air, the extraordinary god of air, the extraordinary goddess of air, the extraordinary goddesses of air, the extraordinary goddess of air, the static god of air, the static gods of air, the static god of air, the static goddess of air, the static goddesses of air, the static goddess of air, the dynamic god of air, the dynamic gods of air, the dynamic god of air, the dynamic goddess of air, the dynamic goddesses of air, the dynamic goddess of air, the land god of air, the land gods of air, the land god of air, the land goddess of air, the land goddesses of air, the land goddess of air, the sea god of air, the sea gods of air, the sea god of air, the sea goddess of air, the sea goddesses of air, the sea goddess of air, the sky god of air, the sky gods of air, the sky god of air, the sky goddess of air, the sky goddesses of air, the sky goddess of air, the god of air, the gods of air, the god of air, the goddess of air, the goddesses of air, the goddess of air, the half god of air, the half gods of air, the half god of air, the half goddess of air, the half goddesses of air, the half goddess of air, the vessel of air, the vessels of air, the vessel of air, the name of air, the names of air, the name of air, the person of air, the persons of air, the person of air, the persona of air, the personas of air, the persona of air, the personage of air, the personages of air, the personage of air, the personality of air, the personalities of air, the personality of air, the personification of air, the personifications of air, the personification of air, the image of air, the images of air, the image of air, the imagination of air, the imaginations of air, the imagination of air, the belief of air, the beliefs of air, the belief of air, the thought of air, the thoughts of air, the thought of air, the word of air, the words of air, the word of air, the action of air, the actions of air, the action of air, the reaction of air, the reactions of air, the reaction of air, the feeling of air, the feelings of air, the feeling of air, the situation of air, the situations of air, the situation of air, the circumstance of air, the circumstances of air, the circumstance of air, the environment of air, the environments of air, the environment of air, the relationship of air, the relationships of air, the relationship of air, the number of air, the numbers of air, the number of air, the formula of air, the formulas of air, the formula of air, the equation of air, the equations of air, the equation of air, the theory of air, the theories of air, the theory of air, the symbol of air, the symbols of air, the symbol of air, the color of air, the colors of air, the color of air, the thing of air, the things of air, the thing of air, the way of air, the ways of air, the way of air, the place of air, the places of air, the place of air, the time of air, the times of air, the time of air, the event of air, the events of air, the event of air, the result of air, the results of air, the result of air, the crown of air, the crowns of air, the crown of air, the throne of air, the thrones of air, the throne of air, the air king, the air kings, the air kingdom, the air kingdoms, the air king's subject, the air king's subjects, the air king's dominion, the air king's dominions, the kingdom of air, the kingdoms of air, the kingdom of air, the air queen, the air queens, the air queendom, the air queendoms, the air queen's subject, the air queen's subjects, the air queen's dominion, the air queen's dominions, the queendom of air, the queendoms of air, the queendom of air, the air prince, the air princes, the air princedom, the air princedoms, the air prince's subject, the air prince's subjects, the air prince's dominion, the air prince's dominions, the princedom of air, the princedoms of air, the princedom of air, the air princess, the air princesses, the air princessdom, the air princessdoms, the air princess's subject, the air princess's subjects, the air princess's dominion, the air princess's dominions, the princessdom of air, the princessdoms of air, the princessdom of air, the lord of air, the lords of air, the lord of air, the lordess of air, the lordesses of air, the lordess of air, the priest of air, the priests of air, the priest of air, the priestess of air, the priestesses of air, the priestess of air, the ritual of air, the rituals of air, the ritual of air, the shrine of air, the shrines of air, the shrine of air, the temple of air, the temples of air, the temple of air, the leader of air, the leaders of air, the leader of air, the follower of air, the followers of air, the follower of air, the natural substance of air, the natural substances of air, the natural substance of air, the supernatural substance of air, the supernatural substances of air, the supernatural substance of air, the temporal substance of air, the temporal substances of air, the temporal substance of air, the spiritual substance of air, the spiritual substances of air, the spiritual substance of air, the natural form of air, the natural forms of air, the natural form of air, the supernatural form of air, the supernatural forms of air, the supernatural form of air, the temporal form of air, the temporal forms of air, the temporal form of air, the spiritual form of air, the spiritual forms of air, the spiritual form of air, the age of air, the ages of air, the age of air, the era of air, the eras of air, the era of air, the awakener of air, the awakeners of air, the awakener of air, the awakening of air, the awakenings of air, the awakening of air, the realm of air, the realms of air, the realm of air, the dimension of air, the dimensions of air, the dimension of air, the zone of air, the zones of air, the zone of air, the frequency of air, the frequencies of air, the frequency of air, the century of air, the centuries of air, the century of air, the millennium of air, the millenniums of air, the millennium of air, the purpose of air, the purposes of air, the purpose of air, the meaning of air, the meanings of air, the meaning of air, the culture of air, the cultures of air, the culture of air, the demonstrator of air, the demonstrators of air, the demonstrator of air, the demonstration of air, the demonstrations of air, the demonstration of air, the manifester of air, the manifestors of air, the manifester of air, the manifestation of air, the manifestations of air, the manifestation of air, the presence of air, the presences of air, the presence of air, the glow of air, the glows of air, the glow of air, the goal of air, the goals of air, the goal of air, the plan of air, the plans of air, the plan of air, the book of air, the books of air, the book of air, the philosopher of air, the philosophers of air, the philosopher of air, the philosophy of air, the philosophies of air, the philosophy of air, the releaser of air, the releasers of air, the releaser of air, the release of air, the releases of air, the release of air, the variable of air, the variables of air, the variable of air, the cause of air, the causes of air, the cause of air, the effect of air, the effects of air, the effect of air, the journey of air, the journeys of air, the journey of air, the emergence of air, the emergences of air, the emergence of air, the source of air, the sources of air, the source of air, the originator of air, the originators of air, the originator of air, the origin of air, the origins of air, the origin of air, the forefather of air, the forefathers of air, the forefather of air, the foremother of air, the foremothers of air, the foremother of air, the ancestor of air, the ancestors of air, the ancestor of air, the descendant of air, the descendants of air, the descendant of air, the lineage of air, the lineages of air, the lineage of air, the heritage of air, the heritages of air, the heritage of air, the heir of air, the heirs of air, the heir of air, the co-heir of air, the co-heirs of air, the co-heir of air, the joint heir of air, the joint heirs of air, the joint heir of air, the dynasty of air, the dynasties of air, the dynasty of air, the force of air, the forces of air, the force of air, the law of air, the laws of air, the law of air, the pact of air, the pacts of air, the pact of air, the game of air, the games of air, the game of air, the mask of air, the masks of air, the mask of air, the armor of air, the armors of air, the armor of air, the sword of air, the swords of air, the sword of air, the shield of air, the shields of air, the shield of air, the force shield of air, the force shields of air, the force shield of air, the armored force shield of air, the armored force shields of air, the armored force shield of air, the champion of air, the champions of air, the champion of air, the guardian of air, the guardians of air, the guardian of air, the defender of air, the defenders of air, the defender of air, the protector of air, the protectors of air, the protector of air, the chant of air, the chants of air, the chant of air, the shape of air, the shapes of air, the shape of air, the cube of air, the cubes of air, the cube of air, the cuboid of air, the cuboids of air, the cuboid of air, the sphere of air, the spheres of air, the sphere of air, the spheroid of air, the spheroids of air, the spheroid of air, the prism of air, the prisms of air, the prism of air, the pyramid of air, the pyramids of air, the pyramid of air, the cylinder of air, the cylinders of air, the cylinder of air, the cone of air, the cones of air, the cone of air, the triangle of air, the triangles of air, the triangle of air, the circle of air, the circles of air, the circle of air, the semicircle of air, the semicircles of air, the semicircle of air, the square of air, the squares of air, the square of air, the rectangle of air, the rectangles of air, the rectangle of air, the parallelogram of air, the parallelograms of air, the parallelogram of air, the rhombus of air, the rhombuses of air, the rhombus of air, the trapezoid of air, the trapezoids of air, the trapezoid of air, the polygon of air, the polygons of air, the polygon of air, the pentagon of air, the pentagons of air, the pentagon of air, the hexagon of air, the hexagons of air, the hexagon of air, the septagon of air, the septagons of air, the septagon of air, the octagon of air, the octagons of air, the octagon of air, the nonagon of air, the nonagons of air, the nonagon of air, the decagon of air, the decagons of air, the decagon of air, the evolution of air, the evolutions of air, the evolution of air, the revolution of air, the revolutions of air, the revolution of air, the elemental art of air, the elemental arts of air, the elemental art of air, the elemental science of air, the elemental sciences of air, the elemental science of air, the elemental principle of air, the elemental principles of air, the elemental principle of air, the elemental technology of air, the elemental technologies of air, the elemental technology of air, the low elemental art of air, the low elemental arts of air, the low elemental art of air, the low elemental science of air, the low elemental sciences of air, the low elemental science of air, the low elemental principle of air, the low elemental principles of air, the low elemental principle of air, the low elemental technology of air, the low elemental technologies of air, the low elemental technology of air, the high elemental art of air, the high elemental arts of air, the high elemental art of air, the high elemental science of air, the high elemental sciences of air, the high elemental science of air, the high elemental principle of air, the high elemental principles of air, the high elemental principle of air, the high elemental technology of air, the high elemental technologies of air, the high elemental technology of air, the agent of air, the agents of air, the agent of air, the agency of air, the agencies of air, the agency of air, the amplifier of air, the amplifiers of air, the amplifier of air, the amplification of air, the amplifications of air, the amplification of air, the enhancer of air, the enhancers of air, the enhancer of air, the enhancement of air, the enhancements of air, the enhancement of air, the magnifier of air, the magnifiers of air, the magnifier of air, the magnification of air, the magnifications of air, the magnification of air, the influencer of air, the influencers of air, the influencer of air, the influence of air, the influences of air, the influence of air, the emanator of air, the emanators of air, the emanator of air, the emanation of air, the emanations of air, the emanation of air, the converger of air, the convergers of air, the converger of air, the convergence of air, the convergences of air, the convergence of air, the aura of air, the auras of air, the aura of air, the impression of air, the impressions of air, the impression of air, the intelligence of air, the intelligences of air, the intelligence of air, the sophistication of air, the sophistications of air, the sophistication of air, the genius of air, the geniuses of air, the genius of air, the polymath of air, the polymaths of air, the polymath of air, the psychic of air, the psychics of air, the psychic of air, the knowledge of air, The knowledge is of air. The knowledge of air. The understanding of air. The understandings of air. The understanding of air. The wisdom of air. The wisdoms of air. The wisdom of air. The secret of air. The secrets of air. The secret of air. The mystery of air. The mysteries of air. The mystery of air. The revelation of air. The revelations of air. The revelation of air. The tactic of air. The tactics of air. The tactic of air. The strategy of air. The strategies of air. The strategy of air. The strength of air. The strengths of air. The strength of air. The might of air. The mights of air. The might of air. The power of air. The powers of air. The power of air. The authority of air. The authorities of air. The authority of air. The dominion of air. The dominions of air. The dominion of air. The rhythm of air. The rhythms of air. The rhythm of air. The melody of air. The melodies of air. The melody of air. The music of air. The musics of air. The music of air. The lyric of air. The lyrics of air. The lyric of air. The song of air. The songs of air. The song of air. The dance of air. The dances of air. The dance of air. The spirit of air. The spirits of air. The spirit of air. The soul of air. The souls of air. The soul of air. The body of air. The bodies of air. The body of air. The mark of air. The marks of air. The mark of air. The promise of air. The promises of air. The promise of air. The visionary of air. The visionaries of air. The visionary of air. The vision of air. The visions of air. The vision of air. The picture of air. The pictures of air. The picture of air. The sound of air. The sounds of air. The sound of air. The dung of air. The dungs of air. The dung of air. The language of air. The languages of air. The language of air. The communication of air. The communications of air. The communication of air. The people of air. The peoples of air. The people of air. The society of air. The societies of air. The society of air. The fortress of air. The fortresses of air. The fortress of air. The government of air. The government of air. The government of air. The city of air. The cities of air. The city of air. The nation of air. The nations of air. The nation of air. The civilization of air. The civilizations of air. The civilization of air. The world of air. The worlds of air. The world of air.